Love this podcast? Support this show through the Acast supporter feature. It's up to you how much you give, and there's no regular commitment. Just hit the link in the show description to support now.
Explaining football to the friend who's just there for the nachos? Hard. Tailgating from home like a pro with snacks and drinks everyone will love? An easy win. And with Instacart helping deliver the snack time MVPs to your door, you're ready for the game in as fast as 30 minutes. So you never miss a play or lose your seat on the couch or have to go head-to-head for the last chicken wing. Shop game day faves on Instacart and enjoy $0 delivery fees on your first 3 grocery orders. Offer valid for a limited time. Other fees and terms apply.
Hey, it's Mark Marin from WTF here to let you know that this podcast is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. And I'm sure the reason you're listening to this podcast right now is because you chose it. Well, choose Progressive's Name Your Price tool, and you could find insurance options that fit your budget, so you can pick the best one for your situation. Who doesn't like choice? Try it at Progressive.com. And now, some legal info. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Price and coverage match limited by state law. Not available in all states.
My dad works in B2B marketing. He came by my school for career day and said he was a big ROAS man. Then he told everyone how much he loved calculating his return on ad spend. My friends still laugh at me to this day.
Not everyone gets B2B, but with LinkedIn, you'll be able to reach people who do. Get a $100 credit on your next ad campaign. Go to linkedin.com/results to claim your credit. That's linkedin.com/results. Terms and conditions apply. LinkedIn, the place to be, to be.
This is Writers on Film, the only podcast dedicated to books on cinema. Hello everybody and welcome to Writers on Film. My name's John Bleasdale. I am a writer and film critic, and today I'm going to be talking to the novelist Anthony Marra. Anthony has written 3 novels: A Constellation of Vital Phenomena, The Tsar of Love and Techno, and his latest book, which we're going to be talking about today, is Mercury Pictures Presents. This novel follows the travails of a fictional studio in the 1940s, America, and a fictional Hollywood studio, I guess is the best way of saying it, and the various workers, owners, or studio heads who are dealing with the running of the studio, but also America's imminent entry into the Second World War, the rise of fascism, the immigrant experience, racism. Lots of different topics are addressed by the novel, but it's also a very funny comic novel, as you will hear me express during our conversation. But it's a really good book. You don't need to have read it to listen to the podcast, because we try to keep it spoiler free, but I've got a feeling if you listen to the conversation you'll want to read the book soon afterwards, so buyer beware in that sense. If you enjoy the podcast, please remember to subscribe and to like and to tweet about it, and to generally, if you could share the word, I would really appreciate it. You can follow me on Twitter at Dr. Jonty, DRJONTY. But before you do any of that, please enjoy the conversation.
So my first 2 books are set in the former Soviet Union. And after writing 2 books in that world, both of which deal in different ways with the intersection of art and politics and the creation of propaganda in the former in the USSR and contemporary Russia. After writing 2 books set in that world, I was ready to come in from the cold, and I I figured where better to warm up than Southern California. I used to live in LA. My wife is from there, and I've always been fascinated with this period in LA's history when you saw this incredible cultural transfusion of emigres fleeing Europe and landing in LA. Frank Lloyd Wright once said that if you tip the world on its side, all of the loose pieces end up in Los Angeles. And I think that was probably never more true than in the 1930s and 40s, when thousands of refugees fleeing fascism landed in LA. And what really fascinated me about that period was the ways in which this community was responsible for many of the movies of the 1940s that are best remembered these days, and how they became an integral part of the American propaganda apparatus during the war, even though as citizens of Axis-aligned countries, they were often denied the very rights and freedoms that their movies championed. And that artistic and moral and political set of contradictions just really seemed like a ripe area to set a novel within. I think that often depictions of filmmaking and depictions of Hollywood, particularly in the Golden Age, really lean into the decadence and the excess, and essentially treat Hollywood as a fundamentally unserious place. In the research I did, in the reading, in the work of a number of guests who have appeared on this very podcast, it seemed to me that view of both the period and the industry was flawed somewhat, and I was interested in maybe taking a somewhat different approach on that period.
Really interesting that you say that, because I think that's what I got. There was a real sense of admiration for some of these people and the mavericks, and not uncritical, but focused. And then you see something like Babylon, which I haven't seen yet. I hasten to add, but even from the title and the reference obviously is to Kenneth Anger's Hollywood Babylon. There's this sense of like that the sleazy Hollywood is the Hollywood that sort of lives most vibrantly in our imaginations. Yeah,
I think that's so true. I think it's not without a degree of merit, but I think, like all, as has been said, the problem with cliches isn't necessarily that it's that cliches are completely false, but that they simply narrow the field of experience to one story. I think I was interested in looking at some of these other stories that appear during this period, and one of the things that I find so fascinating is how the movies that live on in the cultural imagination the most from that period, I think, are the ones that were fundamentally interested in politics in some way. I mean, the movie that I think probably has endured the most is obviously Casablanca, and that's a movie that was made by and about refugees, and it came not only to really define and express the experience of many of the participants in the making of that movie, who had fled Europe, but also came to really define how America came to see itself in that period. And those seem to be some of the films and the stories that maybe undercut this image of Hollywood as this preposterous place filled with frivolous people.
Casablanca I rewatched quite recently, and I thought it's so amazing not only how much that film is, as you say, and Noah Eisenberg's book about it is a really, really good read if our listeners haven't already.
Oh, fantastic. I absolutely love that book.
Yeah, superb. All the stories behind even small roles, people who have come from Germany, I mean, it's it's an anti-Nazi movie, which is so anti-Nazi, even the Nazis are played by anti-Nazis.
Yeah, I think that's a great example, though, of some of the paradoxes that a number of these figures faced, where you have German Jewish actors who can only find work in Hollywood portraying the very villains they thought they had escaped.
Which, of course, you feature in your novel as well, in terms of the character of Ed, who is a Chinese actor, Chinese American, who can only get roles as sort of villainous Japanese post Pearl Harbor, or even, there are other villainous characters that he plays pre Pearl Harbor as well.
It's sort of this rather bizarre set of circumstances in which a number of Asian American actors, Philip Bond, Richard Liu, Chester Gahn, suddenly found themselves in a position where they were in high demand due to the necessity of creating anti-Japanese movies. Eddie, as you mentioned, is this character who has spent his entire career being typecast in roles that fall far below his talents. He's sort of the only major character in the novel who was born in the U.S. And really the only major character who has much genuine talent in the book. But because of the racist typecasting that was so prevalent in Hollywood during that period, both on the set and off, and that continues in many ways through to the present day, he is as much of an outsider and an exile as the emigres that he works with. And following Pearl Harbor, he is hired by the studio Mercury Pictures to play Japanese villains. And one of the things that I found so dramatically interesting about this, sort of circumstance that he finds himself in is that the war really puts this character Eddie in a position where his livelihood comes in direct conflict with his conscience. And I think that this was sort of an existential position that many figures involved in the propaganda business found themselves in, where Eddie really abhors the sort of racist caricatures that he's assigned, but he's also determined to take advantage of this brief moment where he has a bit of bargaining power in an industry that has long marginalized him.
That's what I think makes the novel so fascinating, is how there are these complicated, moments where characters are genuinely challenged by the price of success, and then what they can reap back from those compromises, what they can sort of how they can empower themselves, but does that come at the cost of a larger political problem?
Yeah, absolutely. One of the sort of the through line or perhaps thematic reoccurrences in the novel is the presence of devil's bargains.
Right.
And it's during this time period, Thomas Mann was writing Dr. Faustus in the Pacific Palisades. His son Klaus wrote Mephisto a decade prior, which also is an updated version of the Faustian tale. And I find like Devil's Bargains in general to be an incredibly powerful dramatic tool, because I think that we all face devil's bargains every day on much smaller scales, that every choice is a compromise to one extent or another. And I think that these moral conflicts are perhaps more interesting than other forms of conflict, because it pits characters not only against outside forces but also against themselves. And so throughout the novel, more or less every character every major character faces some kind of devil's bargain. And in fact, that is the name of one of the movies that this studio is producing, that gets them in quite hot water with a number of reactionary forces in the months leading up to Pearl Harbor.
I don't want to obviously spoil the novel too much for people who haven't had an opportunity to read it yet, although I'm sure there'll be a lot of people who've already read it listening to this. But let's let's sort of, how would you set it up for someone who hasn't read the novel what's your sort of, your elevator pitch, so to speak?
Yeah, the book is set within a studio called Mercury Pictures, which is I sort of envisioned as almost a Poverty Row version of Warner Brothers, a studio whose movies are a mix of schlock and social message movies that rely on the free publicity of scandal to generate publicity. And the studio is run by Artie and Ned Feldman, who are loosely based on Jack and Harry Warner. And our sort of focal point for the novel is Artie's right hand woman, a character named Maria Lagana, who is an associate producer. And she was probably my favorite character to write. I sort of she's this tough, ambitious, irreverent driver. I pictured her as Rosalind Russell's character in His Girl Friday, only a bit more salty and a lot more Italian. And when we first meet her, her boss, Artie, is under investigation by isolationists in the U.S. Congress. The studio is struggling financially, and her personal and professional lives are in a bit of a state. And like many characters in the book, she arrives to Mercury essentially in flight from Europe. She grew up in fascist Italy and fled to Los Angeles with her mother after a childhood transgression led to her father's arrest. And her father is imprisoned in southern Italy, and her experience over the course of her adolescence with writing to him and sort of trying to negotiate the postal censor in Italy that censors their correspondence sort of gives her a talent for writing around censors, which proves beneficial to her career in Hollywood, where the censorship of the production code is one of the primary governing forces. So even though Maria has sort of reinvented herself as this unflappable producer, she is still haunted by the role that she played in her father's fate, until one day a man from her father's past arrives at the studio among all of these other refugees that have come to Mercury to find work. And with his appearance, the various fictions she has spun to survive begin to unravel.
It's funny how I love that idea of Rosalind Russell. Who did you picture as Artie then? Because I mean they're
definitely not Cary Grant.
Right? Yeah, no, that would have worked. Well, first of all, Cary Grant's got a full head of hair.
It's true. Yeah. So I one of the real joys of writing a novel set in this world is that you can sort of move between different styles and tropes. So for a lot of the front office, business was very much pitched in a screwball comedy sort of mode. There are other chapters that sort of send up, some of the film noir traditions. There are, obviously, war film becomes a fact later in the book, and sort of being able to shift between, some of the most popular genres of the period became one of the underlying interests and motives for writing it.
But you're not going to give me a name,
I'm not.
Also, when you the very title sort of the studio Mercury Pictures makes me think immediately of Orson Welles as a possible thing, and I was kind of thinking, yeah, Warner's. But then Jack Warner's is actually in the novel, so there's a bit where it can't be Warner's because there's Warner's,
right?
A little bit RKO because just of the fact that it's got the Mercury and the Orson Welles connection. But then I was also thinking there's a little bit of sort of ahistorically there's a little bit of sort of a Roger Corman kind of structure to this sort of a studio that's definitely hanging on by its fingernails financially.
Yeah. I was sort of I sort of pictured Mercury as being at the same sort of the same level of a Republic or a Monogram, sort of a studio of that level of financial security and artistic achievement. Yeah, I sort of there's an Orson Welles reference sort of midway through the book when the attack on Pearl Harbor was announced in LA. A number of people assumed that it was Orson Welles, sort of causing a panic again, as he did with his War of the Worlds broadcast. And one of the reasons that I wanted to sort of tip my hat to Orson Welles and Mercury in the title and in the name of the studio is the fact that the War of the Worlds broadcast created this hysteria in America in a similar way as some of the films that Mercury Pictures, this fictitious studio, creates a degree of panic following Pearl Harbor and the release of a number of these propaganda movies.
Yeah, I mean, you've got this great structure as well of having sort of a situation and then quite lengthy sort of flashbacks to provide context for some of these characters, particularly in Maria at the very beginning, but then you have other characters, Italian characters, who go back to fill in their thing. But it's also interesting in terms of the sort of history and the moment, the situation that they find themselves in the moment, that Europe is kind of rehearsing the Second World War before the Second World War starts, and fascism is there long before before Nazism is there, and so you've got this situation where the characters can see sort of, and some of them have experienced it before it comes to America, so to speak. I was thinking particularly in the case of Maria's father, that idea of the particular Mussolini's sort of like invention of sort of exiling people within the country so that they would be sent to a village. I live in Italy, and I know that in Italy, your identity is very much based on your local region where you're from. So that if you get sent to the south and you're from the north, or vice versa, then you're very much, it's like a foreign country. And that sort of situation is similar to how a lot of the characters find themselves in. There's no prison around them, but there is a kind of psychological prison, if you like.
Yeah, and it's interesting that the sort of connection between how internal exiles in Italy experienced exile and how these refugees in America experienced exile during the war was actually sort of the point when the book really came together for me. So when I began thinking about this project, it was originally I was debating between writing a novel set exclusively in LA during this period, and one set in southern Italy during this similar period, and I sort of envisioned them as two separate novels. And for months I was bouncing back and forth between the two of them. I'm not particularly known for decisiveness. I have trouble committing to an appetizer, let alone a multi-year book project. And things finally came together for me when my wife and I took a trip to Lipari, which is the largest of the Aeolian Islands off the coast of Sicily. It's also happens to be where my great-grandmother's family emigrated from. And it's this stunning island. It's one of this chain of volcanic islands with these sweeping views and spectacular beaches. And it looks like just a postcard from paradise. And on one of our last days there, we noticed this little plaque that was high up on the wall of the Citadel. And the plaque commemorated the various anti-fascists and artists and intellectuals who had been exiled to Lipari by Mussolini. And in fact, Lipari was the largest internment colony in Italy under Mussolini. And I had never heard of this particular chapter in the island's history. And it was hard to imagine that this island paradise that I could, trace my own roots to had once been Mussolini's Alcatraz. And it occurred to me as I was, sort of standing there, that German and Austrian exiles sometimes referred to Los Angeles as sunny Siberia. And it seemed that this same term could be easily applied to Lipari as well. And so it seemed that to me that Los Angeles and that the Los Angeles novel and the Italy novel weren't two separate books, but were rather halves of the same book. And that Mercury Pictures Presents would be the story of these two sunny Siberias and this one family divided between them.
That's fascinating. That's so interesting that we you look at these places and you sometimes think, as you say, they're sunny, they're wonderful from a certain point of view, but if you're forced to be there, it doesn't matter where it is and what you're doing. It's that idea of compulsion and the lack of freedom which makes it.
Yeah, and sort of as you said, that like so much of the sense of confinement and imprisonment was psychological. That these were places, both in Italy and in the areas where internal exiles were sent. There wouldn't be barbed wire. There wouldn't be big walls. It was often simply a particular area that they were allowed to live in, and they weren't allowed to go past these sort of invisible markers outside of whether it was the town limits or a river or what have you. And in Los Angeles during the war, citizens of Axis countries were classified as enemy aliens, even if they fled to the U.S. as refugees, and they were prohibited from traveling more than 5 miles from their house. If they lived on the coastline, they were forced to move inland. They had to surrender cameras, radios, flashlights, anything that could potentially be used to spy or commit acts of sabotage. And the ways in which the U.S. began to in some subtle ways resemble and put into practice elements from the very fascist countries that they were at war with felt to me like an aspect of the history of World War II on the American home front that is often downplayed in our history. I think that Americans tend to be very proud of our role in the Second World War with some justification. I think it's often because we've been involved in so many disastrous foreign wars in the years since, and at least we can look back on this one and say, well, we were on the side of the angels. But I think that sort of greatest generation mythology often maybe flattens some of the complexities and the ways in which we were complicit in the very evils that we purportedly fighting against.
Yeah, absolutely. Specifically in the treatment of the Japanese in terms of and also sort of you're fighting an ideology which has at its core a racism. And then you use racism for your own propaganda ends in terms of demonizing, which I think was always more true in the Pacific theater and the Japanese enemy than it was against the Germans. You couldn't really, Anglo-Europeans couldn't really turn to the Germans and use racist epithets against them.
Yeah, I think that is entirely true, and it's also it's visible in the very movies of the time. Did you ever read Projections of War by Thomas Doherty?
No, I haven't. No,
it's a brilliant book. All of his books are fantastic. But in Projections of War, he goes through and looks at how Germans, Italians, and Japanese were portrayed as villains, and how so often and it's their images that endure to this day. The portrayal of Nazis as these cool, callous, sort of sociopathic villains. Who are very calculating and devious, and but in a way highly rational. Whereas Italians were usually portrayed as, if they were portrayed as at all, as sort of buffoons, like they were the comic relief,
who would often swap sides at some point in the film. Would often
exactly.
maybe be won over to the good side, maybe be sort of traitorous and but definitely untrustworthy.
Yeah. Whereas Japanese, the Japanese characters in these movies often weren't even presented as characters. They were. I think it was Thomas Doherty's book. Maybe it might have been Hollywood Goes to War. It might have been in Hollywood Goes to War by Clayton Copps, where the author looks at how Native Americans were portrayed in Westerns and how Japanese soldiers were portrayed in World War II films, and how both the ways in which they were othered, the ways in which they were presented as less than human, as being denied even the humanity of a point of view in the actual shot by shot.
That's fascinating, because I was watching Thin Red Line recently, and I think that film is very interesting in how it doesn't show the Japanese, almost like it's a Vietnam War movie in which the Viet Cong are represented by the jungle rather than by actual soldiers. You see the sort of consequences of their, you first come across corpses that have been desecrated, and then you see and then they're just sort of points of fire, and then they're a gun barrel. And then when they actually get to the Japanese, they're obviously these emaciated, malarial, suffering, human beings, wretches, really. But then there's this remarkable shot of a Japanese face that's basically been pounded into the earth, and you get the voiceover of this Japanese soldier saying, "Are you noble? Do you think I wasn't loved? Do you think I wasn't admired? Do you think this made me immune to what the world did to me?" And it's just, I'm paraphrasing, but it's just such a fascinating and unusual way of showing the enemy of the war film through a series of stages, which actually by the end of it is kind of quite empathetic.
That's fascinating. Yeah, and I mean that seems like something that you certainly wouldn't have seen in the films of the 40s.
Yeah. What's the Bogart movie as well, isn't there? There's a Bogart movie with Sidney Greenstreet. Is it like Northwest Passage or something, which is very virulently anti-Japanese?
Yeah. I mean, so many of them. Like the most heinous, I think, was probably Little Tokyo, USA, in part because it's the filmmakers actually went to Little Tokyo in Los Angeles and filmed the forced relocation of Japanese Americans and included it in the film as the film describes it, sort of like the just result for sabotage. And so not only does the film, does this film essentially not only excuse but really celebrate the decision to intern Japanese Americans, but it also used those very real human beings as extras in this grotesque movie in a way that I think is beyond ugly, and is one of those cases where you look at that movie and it's feels like a Nazi propaganda movie in terms of its demonization and the way that it blends this sort of paranoid espionage plot with the very real ramifications of that kind of racialized hysteria that was gripping the U.S. at the time. I think that one of the things about the movies of this period and that in the novel I just found myself fascinated with is how a culture defines its enemies says so much more about that culture than it does about the supposed monsters. And I think that obviously America has an incredibly troubled history with race, and so often we have historically defined villains along racial lines, and that was certainly the case in so many of these movies of the 1940s.
Yeah, and so there's a sort of sense of projection as well with the I always think that Hollywood very much goes on the man bites dog sort of. I mean, I think it's something not necessarily inherent in Hollywood as such, but inherent in all drama, all fiction, all novels, is that sort of goes against the idea of like art as being this sort of purveyor of truth. Is if you read books, there's much more. If you read novels, thinking you're going to get a view of what reality is like, it's going to be skewed very much in favor of drama and murder and violence and betrayal and all these sort of things, rather than the rather humdrum reality of what life's actually like. I was thinking recently of an example of that being the sort of hoopla over the new film Tar, which seems to be, let's do a sort of Me Too story, but with the male figure changed into a female figure, so that it's about bullying and it's about inappropriate use of power. But we'll swap out the man for a woman because, that's man bites dog. That's, dog bites man isn't interesting in the same way. So,
yeah, I think one of the so my wife is an art historian specializing in photography. And when my previous book, The Tsar of Love and Techno, came out, when I should say while I was working on it, she showed me a number of these folios of photographs from the Civil War. Combat photographers were moving around corpses, were sort of staging scenes. And the idea that, 10 years after the advent of photography, it was already being used to manipulate reality and sort of record these images that purported to be real, that were nonetheless staged, is something that I've always been sort of fascinated with. This idea that at the, this tension at the heart of filmmaking, that it's a medium that can be both subjective art and objective evidence. It can be used to create fantasy and record reality. And this is, I think, an unresolvable conflict at the heart of the medium. I think many of these characters struggle with, and that I think filmmakers in general have to contend with.
Yeah. And I guess novels don't have that same direct ability to even purport to transparency. You can't. It's obviously a narrative. It's obviously these are stories being told, and with your novel, there's a sense of people having backstories, for instance, that are viewed in different ways. Different characters experience roughly the same thing, but they have totally different views of how that event actually happened, or why it happened, or what the consequences are. One thing I wanted to ask actually was the way we're talking about it now. It sounds very, very serious. We're talking about major events, and we're giving them the necessary respect they deserve, absolutely. But your book's so funny, and it's without
Explaining football to the friend who's just there for the nachos? Hard. Tailgating from home like a pro with snacks and drinks everyone will love? An easy win. And with Instacart helping deliver the snack time MVPs to your door, you're ready for the game in as fast as 30 minutes. So you never miss a play or lose your seat on the couch or have to go head-to-head for the last chicken wing. Shop Game Day Faves on Instacart and enjoy $0 delivery fees on your first 3 grocery orders. Offer valid for a limited time. Other fees and terms apply.
My dad works in B2B marketing. He came by my school for career day and said he was a big ROAS man. Then he told everyone how much he loved calculating his return on ad spend. My friends still laugh at me to this day.
Not everyone gets B2B, but with LinkedIn, you'll be able to reach people who do. Get $100 credit on your next ad campaign. Go to linkedin.com/results to claim your credit. That's linkedin.com/results. Terms and conditions apply. LinkedIn, the place to be, to be.
In any way rendering what it's not silly, it's not funny in a silly way, it's not unserious, but it is very, very funny. And I just wanted to make sure we convey to our listeners that this is a really fun read, despite or even because of the fact that what it's talking about is a serious moment in history.
Yeah, well, thank you. I'm relieved to hear that. I find myself just really impatient with humorless novels and humorless movies. I
Right.
think that, to me, life feels essentially to be an absurd enterprise. And I think that absurdity is most eloquently expressed through humor. I think that, humor is sort of how we try to comprehend the incomprehensible. So I think that that no matter how serious the subject of a particular work is, if there's not humor in it, it feels kind of false to me. I come from a people who make jokes at all of the wrong moments. I think that even when we're in the midst of tragedy, there is a natural tendency to try to find a bit of comedy in it. And I think that, when I think about like some of the movies that have meant the most to me and that have hit me the hardest, particularly from this period, the movie more than any other one would have to be To Be or Not to Be by Ernst Lubitsch. And that's a movie that is profoundly funny, and yet it is set in the most serious and desperate of times. That's a movie that is set in occupied Poland. It came out in 1942, 3 months after Pearl Harbor. It feels, watching it today, it's this, for anyone who hasn't seen it, I strongly recommend you do. It stars Jack Benny and Carol Lombard. It was Carol Lombard's last film prior to her death, and it's this satire of this Polish theater company essentially trying to use the various tricks of their trade to escape Poland. It is, it's laugh out loud funny. Like there are moments of high farce. And yet Lubitsch, I feel like throughout the movie, he wields comedy like a scalpel. And I feel like watching it, you come to sense that that a joke can be a deadly serious thing. And he is relentless with using satire to expose the horrors of life under Nazi rule. And the idea that a movie can be both, so silly and so somber at the same time is something that has certainly influenced my own work to a great degree. And I think that those are the experiences that I most often try to seek out, whether in a novel or on the screen.
It's interesting that Lubitsch's film was being made prior to Pearl Harbor, and you did have these. I was talking to Chris last for the last episode of last episode but one, with his book Hollywood Hates Hitler. You had these films like Confessions of a Nazi Spy and The Great Dictator coming out prior to Pearl Harbor, and this is also where you take the beginning of your book is where you have Mercury and Artie having to go to Washington and sort of defend themselves because, and this is another thing that, you referred to the Great Generation and the Good War. Another detail which is sometimes forgotten or glossed over is that prior to Pearl Harbor, there was a fairly bullish large section of the population and of the political class that wanted to stay well out of the war and actually had some admiration for the German Nazi party and for the sort of Axis, what then became the Axis powers.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Charles Lindbergh, was the spokesman for the America First Committee, and he was, now we think of him as this simply as a celebrated aviator, but he was perhaps the biggest celebrity, the most influential cultural figure of that moment, and he was 100% in favor of playing nice with Germany and essentially letting England deal with the problems in their backyard on their own and staying well out of it. I think that there is a tendency to imagine that World War II began in December 1941, and obviously that wasn't the case. And for the years prior, we did isolationism was far more popular a policy stance than interventionism in the U.S. And one of the things that I found so interesting, and you referenced Chris and his book Hollywood Hates Hitler is absolutely brilliant. I recommend that anyone who hasn't read it pick it up. I also recently got my hands on his new biography of the Warner Brothers, which is fantastic as well. But he, in that book, he describes the investigation into so-called war propaganda by a group of isolationist senators who wanted to essentially force Hollywood's hand in the few cases in which anti-Nazi movies were being produced. And yeah, I think that that in how we look at America, so I think that this is a historical novel, and I think that one of the pitfalls of historical fiction in general is that there's often a degree of nostalgia to the project. And one of the guiding principles that I sort of set out for myself when I was working on this is to try to avoid nostalgia at all costs, and look at how history was fictionalized within these moments themselves. And so looking at 1939, 1940, 1941, at the American, the forces in America that were most belligerently against any sort of intervention felt like a worthwhile project.
They provide their own sort of comic seriousness as well, in the sense that what they're trying to do is very serious and very dangerous, and of course has echoes. Well, not echoes. What's the word? Sort of forewarnings, I guess, of HUAC in the 50s and on, of where the lessons have sort of to some degree have been learned, and Hollywood kind of collapses in a way that it doesn't in the 1941 version.
Yeah, I mean it's sort of fascinating how given how successful Hollywood was in fighting, in sort of acquitting themselves during, the late 30s and 40s and early 40s in these various show trials. It's understandable why, in the late 40s, they went into the HUAC investigations really feeling like they had this in hand, and to see how sort of quickly they collapsed in those cases is quite dismaying, and you can see how perhaps in retrospect their successes in the 1941 Senate investigations led them to enter the HUAC trials with perhaps a sense of overconfidence and maybe a degree of having underestimated how American culture and society had changed in the intervening years.
Another of the sort of crossovers as well, where you sort of I'm sure these are sort of intentional nods. You already mentioned the Orson Welles nod to the Martian radio story, but 1941, the film that Steven Spielberg makes, which is kind of a weirdly disastrous film in some ways, and a disaster film in another, because it's all about massive destruction. That the moment that actually inspired that film, which is a sort of fear of the Japanese were attacking Los Angeles, and various anti-aircraft guns fire off, and you get a little bit of a mass panic there as well. You refer to that and depict that scene as well. Did you have a little bit of Spielberg in your head while you were doing that?
There's always a little Spielberg in my head. But yeah, I mean the Battle of Los Angeles is this sort of iconic moment, I think, in LA history, in terms of the panic it wrought, all the fear and hysteria that came out of that, but also how in some ways the Battle of Los Angeles feels like something from a movie where a battle against shadows. There was nothing there. It was a lot of light, a lot of special effects, and the only casualties, I believe, were people who got in traffic accidents during.
Yeah, the evacuation was more costly than the thing they were evacuating to avoid. I mean,
exactly.
It sort of also goes to show how acts of the imagination can be great. We can have movies, we can have novels, we can have. But also acts of the imagination can be, from political ideologies to to mass hysteria can cause untold damage.
Yeah, I think that, one of my pet peeves are in literature are novels that sort of uncritically fetishize storytelling as this unadulterated good, that that the very act of telling a story is somehow virtuous in and of itself. And I think that that there's a similar instinct in many films that valorize filmmaking as
and if another love letter to cinema. God damn it, we've had 5 this year, 5, and it's only January the 2nd.
Exactly. Yeah, I think that that there's something that I find troubling in the idea that that the medium itself is seen as morally as morally righteous, when in fact a novel, a story, a movie, like any other instrument of persuasion, can be used for very destructive ends. And I think that it's something that I think in the past 7 years or so, certainly in America, we've been thinking of, or hopefully we've been considering more and more, just in terms of the fictions that have been spun by so many of our political leaders in ways that are very damaging. And I think that as as a novelist, I'm always aware that the very thing that I'm doing essentially creating fabrications, even if they're fabrications built on research and built on sources and anchored in reality, they're still fictions. How the very tools of my trade can be used by political actors to really destructive ends. And I think that we would be wise as artists in general to be more wary of our mediums.
Yeah, absolutely. The co-opting of sort of the ability to it's similarly with humor. I mean, the rise of the alt-right on the internet has been absolutely, the rocket fuel that they've used as this sort of only kidding, just kidding irony, wink, wink, don't be so serious. Oh, haha, got you, and trolling, the entire activity of trolling is based on a sort of tension between the serious and the what do you really mean? Are you really, what are you really saying? It's, we use, I remember 10 years ago, postmodernism being all about that sort of play, unfortunately, when someone turns up to the playground with bad intentions, we no longer have anywhere to stand which is properly secure, I think. Wow. That was very deep.
You should have a podcast.
Yeah, I should do, shouldn't I? Like every other white man in his 50s. Absolutely. I love going back and rethinking about Hollywood from this period, and I really appreciated the opportunity to do so with your novel. I'd love to know as well, though, sort of, do you have any books that you would recommend our readers to go to? I'm going to drop this question on you, because usually I ask for a recommended book, but I'm also interested in, were there any like novels about Hollywood that you particularly, or about filmmaking in general, that you particularly would like to underline and point out?
Yeah, it's a great question. So maybe first I'll start with some nonfiction. So my absolute favorite book on 1940s Hollywood is City of Nets by Otto Friedrich, which is just a remarkable book. He wrote it intentionally avoiding all in-person interviews. He came to sort of see that most of the players in Hollywood were relentlessly untruthful about their own histories, and so he relied only on other books, and I believe he sort of condensed 500 sources, 500 books into City of Nets, and he has just this genius for managing to pick out the most interesting little tidbits. And as a novelist, I feel like I'm always looking for, I'm much less interested in big sweeping airplane view histories, and I'm much more interested in sort of like the little texture, the textures and the small particulars and specifics that gradually grow into characters. And so, for instance, one of the little details that I actually begin the acknowledgments of my own book with comes from City of Nets. It's this anecdote about Irving Thalberg, who was making a movie and he wanted to have this romantic Parisian seascape scene. And those of us who have seen a map or have been to France will realize that Paris is nowhere near the ocean, and this fact was underlined and pointed out to Thalberg by his various assistants, who used maps and atlases to demonstrate this. And Thalberg was not deterred. His response was that he refused to cater to the handful of people who knew Paris. And City of Nets is just filled with those wonderful little anecdotes. I would also say another book that I really loved and that I relied on a lot was Hollywood, the Dream Factory by the wonderfully named Hortense Powdermaker.
That's a novelist's invention. That person does not exist.
I didn't believe so either, but she has a Wikipedia page, so she must be real. But she was an anthropologist who I believe did field work in Papua New Guinea and came back to the U.S. and essentially treated Hollywood as she would a group of any other sort of closed society that she had been studying in Papua New Guinea, and she looks at the various taboos, the rituals, the power structures, the dreams and desires, and all of this that governed Hollywood in the 40s. And it's this really fascinating look at how Hollywood sort of organized itself in terms of power and taboos. And she had, because she wasn't a journalist, she was an anthropologist. She had access to a number of people who perhaps wouldn't have been as willing to speak with an on the record journalist. So that book is absolutely wonderful. And maybe the final fiction book that I will highlight is Hollywood. God, these books are terribly titled. They're all like Hollywood : this. So this one is Hollywood, the Movie Colony, the movie makers, and it's by Leo Roston. And he was a sociologist, I believe, who came to Hollywood in the early 40s with a team of statisticians. And essentially, it's an academic book that is wildly engaging, and he picks up just so many wonderful little snippets, many of which I incorporated into this novel. Even his footnotes are brilliant. In one footnote he describes this high school student who essentially rented out this network of clappers to attend premieres.
Oh yes, I remember that from your novel. Yes, that's a brilliant story.
So that was in one of his footnotes. So this is a book that was so good. I ended up I underlined it the first time I read it, and I underlined so much that I had to go back and re-underline in a different color just to to cut things down a bit. But unfortunately it's out of print. But if you can get find a copy at a library or get a secondhand copy, I would highly recommend it. In terms of fiction, certainly The Day of the Locusts by Nathaniel West was a big influence. I think that that he is someone who obviously had worked in sort of the down market end of the Hollywood, the Hollywood movie making business, and he I think explores that with great sensitivity and beauty in Dave the Locust. So of the various Hollywood novels, I think that would be the one from that period that I felt most influenced by.
I only know that via the film. And the film kind of really depresses me. So, I should go back to the original, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a fantastic book. It's definitely it's definitely not a I wouldn't call it uplifting, but it's one that I feel like, at the time he was working. I believe he was writing B pictures at RKO. He wrote in this period Stranger on the Third Floor, which I believe has been cited as sort of one of the first kind of noir films to emerge. I think that was in
Peter Lorre film, I think, if I remember right.
Exactly, yeah. Who gets top billing but only appears in the last 5 minutes of the film. But yeah, he's someone who I don't think he really broke in to the screenwriting world the way that he hoped he would, but that book is fantastic.
Right. I've definitely got it on my list. It's one of those little holes in my reading background that I need to fill as soon as possible. In fact, I'm buying a lot of those Library of America hardbacks, and I think there's a Nathaniel West, and he's that justifies the outlay of $30, I reckon.
Between that and Miss Lonely Hearts, you're set.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's research I'm doing. It's not for my own pleasure. It's not for my own. I'm sacrificing myself to the world's of film and books and podcasts. So.
Exactly.
Another recommendation I just wanted to add on top, not of a book but of a film. Anybody interested in the internal exile situation? I'm sure this is a film you're probably familiar with. I'm not sure if it was a film or originally sort of like a mini series, a 3-part. Was Rosie's Christ Stopped at Eberly, starring Gian Maria Volonté, which is a really good sort of portrayal of an intellectual who finds himself in a situation similar to one we were talking about earlier, where he's in internal exile in Italy. And anything with Gian Maria Volonté is worth watching because he's for my money, he's the best Italian actor.
Yeah, no, that's fantastic. I actually got to see it in the theater.
Wow.
It was because it never received an American theatrical release, I believe, it was released in theaters maybe 4 years ago.
Right.
Yeah, I saw it. I was living in Oakland, California at the time, and the theater was it was completely sold out. There were a couple of people were scalping tickets outside. It was kind of wild to see that much interest in a movie from the 70s, I believe. And I would also say encourage people to read the book it's based on as well by Carlo Levi.
Yeah.
It's an absolutely brilliant book, and one I think it's a very faithful adaptation, but also so much of the book is simply about Levi's sort of quiet musings on the various towns that he finds himself in, and he has this one. God, I don't believe it made it into the movie, but he has this one scene describing this sort of public toilet facility in one of the towns that he found himself in, and it's this sort of like gorgeous marble thing, and it's in this. It's in this town where there's no running water, where there's no, electricity, and it turns out that the mayor's brother-in-law is a toilet purveyor up north, and a bunch of ducklings have sort of come to live in one of the toilet bowls, and another one is used as for laundry, and it's just this brilliant image. He describes this toilet as being an asteroid that had landed in the south from the north, and yeah, just really quite beautiful.
Wow. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's a great recommendation. And I was also, these are just a couple of things, because I didn't want to interrupt you when you were talking earlier, but a couple of things that it reminded me of when we were talking. One was when you mentioned Thomas Mann and his son, how maybe I got this from Otto Friedrich's City of Nets, actually, that his son used to write down subjects on his cuffs, so that when he had dinner with his father, Thomas Mann, he could talk to him, because otherwise he was sort of paralyzed with nervousness talking to his father. So he was up to the intellectual level of his father, and I always thought that was hilarious, in an incredibly sad way, but still, still hilarious. So, Dad, what do you think of the decimalization of
very casual?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, moving on. Egon Shell. And the other thing that when we were talking right at the very beginning, and this is probably a good way of folding it up, about how we look to Hollywood and we see sort of Fatty Arbuckle and the sort of the sleazy, the scandalous, and the Babylonian nature of it. I was researching a novel once, and I was lucky enough to get to know Frank Cottrell Boyce, who for many years wrote screenplays for Danny Boyle, and I sent him a version of the novel to because it was based on an independent film being made in Britain, and I wanted to see if it was realistic. And and one of my main characters was this sort of like alcoholic director, and he said the whole premise of the novel is problematic because the guy wouldn't get the money, and there would be someone on top of him at all times, and he couldn't just wander off for the night and go drinking and go partying or whatever. There would be someone from the studio sort of sitting on him, and he'd have an early night, and he would, and he was talking about his relationship with Danny Boyle, and said, how Danny would, he would work very, very hard, be up first person on the set, last person to go home, then he'd watch dailies, then he'd have 5 hours sleep, and then he'd start again. And this idea that there's this sort of like, whoa, here we go, just is very rare, because ultimately it's an industry, and if you're not making the product, I think we've seen some situations in which that people have gone off the rails a bit. Bohemian Rhapsody most recently, perhaps, in terms of that sort of lifestyle not being conducive to creating an actual film, and how Hollywood sort of will. I wonder if in the case of Bohemian Rhapsody, Bryan Singer will recover from that. Not in terms of whatever perceived scandals, of which I believe there are some, but more because you didn't do the job, you didn't finish the movie.
Yeah, I think it's there are obviously similar images, sort of these romantic images that we have of novelists as well, in terms of being alcoholics who drag themselves to the typewriter and produce genius, and in my own experience as a writer, in terms of the writers that I know, the people who are up late doing drugs and partying aren't up early, writing. And I think that all artistic creation is difficult, and I think that the people whose work we most admire, the people who are most productive, the people whose movies and whose novels endure, I think are more often than not those that take their craft seriously, and I think that whether you're a director or a novelist or a photographer, if your work isn't at the center of your life, it's difficult to find the wherewithal to continue producing.
Yeah, absolutely. I totally agree. We love the romantic idea of the guy who just sits down at the piano and writes, Rhapsody in Blue. But I know it's been a little bit challenged, the old 10,000 hours idea from Malcolm Gladwell popularized in one of his essays. I know it's not science, let's say, but I think as an idea, you've got to put in the work. Other stuff around that. I mean, I don't know. There are the exceptional. I mean, I think of someone like Rainer Werner Fassbinder and his, but I mean, he had a huge appetite for drugs and drink but also he must have had a huge appetite for work, because my God, what did he produce? He produced like 2 or 3 films a year. He produced a massive 30-hour-long television program that was that is considered probably his masterpiece with Berlin Alexanderplatz. But maybe he's the exception that proves the rule, because crikey, some of his films are amazing.
Yeah, no, I think there's probably always there are probably always outliers, but I had a teacher who used to say that they would only write when they were inspired, but they made sure that they were inspired at 9 a.m. Monday through Friday. And I always felt like that for me at least has been a good way to think of artistic inspiration and all of that.
Yeah, absolutely. I totally agree with that. It's about sitting down. If you can master sitting down, then the rest of it's relatively easy. Brilliant. Oh, thank you so much, Anthony, for coming on the podcast and talking about your novel. It was an absolute pleasure to read. And I highly recommend it. That can be my recommended book of the week.
Oh, well, thank you so much for having me. This has been such a treat.
So that was my conversation with Anthony. I hope you enjoyed it. I had a great time talking to him. I loved his novel and I highly recommend it. Mercury Pictures Presents is the title. So there you go. You can get that from all good booksellers everywhere. All that's left... Oh, his recommended books were Otto Friedrich's City of Nets, which has been recommended before. I think it might even have been recommended in the first ever episode of Writers on Film. But it's such a brilliant book. It deserves multiple recommendations. So if you haven't had an opportunity to read it, that would be one to go for. I would love to have Otto Friedrich on the podcast, but unfortunately he died several years ago. All that's left for me to do is to thank Elliot Atkins from the music, Ali Harwood for the art, and to thank you, dear listeners. It's a new year. 2023 has just begun. What a great episode to begin with, and hopefully we're going to go on and continue with Writers on Film for as long as the guests want to talk to me and for as long as you wish to hear. Thank you very much for supporting us through last year, and looking forward to a bunch of new guests and a bunch of great experiences and episodes and conversations. Take care.
$1-800-Flowers.com knows that a gift is never just a gift. A gift is an expression of everything you feel and helps build more meaningful relationships. 1-800-Flowers takes the pressure off by helping you navigate life's important moments by making it simple to find the perfect gift. From flowers and cookies to cake and chocolate, 1-800-Flowers helps guide you in finding the right gift to say how you feel. To learn more, visit 1-800-Flowers.com/ACAST. That's 1-800-Flowers.com/ACAST.
Cue the fireplace and your favorite fall movie. There's nothing better than a cozy evening at home with a glass of First Leaf wine. First Leaf is a personalized wine club that delivers right to your door. Sounds magical, right? They get to know your favorite tasting notes, which varietals you enjoy, and whether you prefer sweet or dry wines. So in every shipment, you get bottles tailored to your unique palate. Go to tryfirstleaf.com/fall to get your first 6 wines for just $44.95 with free shipping.
This episode is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Do you ever think about switching insurance companies to see if you could save some cash? Progressive makes it easy to see if you could save when you bundle your home and auto policies. Try it at Progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Potential savings will vary, not available in all states.